Welcome to another episode of the Soul Sovereignty and Sexuality Podcast with myself, Jessica Falcon. And I have a special guest today, Carla Ionescu. And we're going to talk about how ancient wisdom, particularly the ancient goddess traditions, support us in the modern day world, support us to transform, support what we're going through and what we're experiencing internationally, how we can use this ancient wisdom to benefit us, to remember our power, to reclaim our sovereignty, to be in our truth, and also to tap into what the goddess offers and why it's relevant, because we have been so deeply disconnected from the power of the goddess, from the power of the feminine. And so we'll dive into what the goddess really means, right? To each of us, we'll dive into that level of feminine power. And I want us to start with a conversation, Carla, about why this matters and how we can access this ancient wisdom from your perspective as a historian, as a researcher, as an expert on Artemis. How would you describe that?
So thank you for having me, first of all. I'm really glad to be here and actually have this conversation. I think your inspiration is so timely. It's something that I've been thinking about for a while. People often ask me, like, why is this useful and how is it applicable and all that kind of stuff. But I'm finding that lately, especially with the most recent research, as they're sort of digging up or analyzing ancient graves, ancient bones. They just found this knife up in somewhere in Northern Europe. I can't remember right now. Oh, it's one of the Slavic countries. Anyways, and other materials coming to light that is showing I want to say the sort of egalitarian relationship between men and women, but also the authority of women in religious perspective, in hunting experience, in ritual performance. So what I'm saying is that we are seeing more and more revelations of women really ruling the world. So there's a part of me that is starting to suspect that we have been sold this bill of lies for a long time, about hunter-gatherers, about long patriarchy, about the evolution of power and authority and all this kind of stuff. One of the things that's coming up for me a lot is that actually women were in charge, and I say this in quotation marks, of the world, again in quotation marks, much longer than we had thought. They had much more authority than we have been taught. They had much more presence than we have been taught. And we're seeing that come to light. And I think a lot of people's reactions is always like, here we are replacing patriarchy with matriarchy, but it's not the same thing, right? So when women are in authority, it's a very different society. It's a very different context. It's a very different way of sharing resources, of thinking about power, etc. So I think we are starting to tune in towards that more and more. And I think once that starts to become a reality, we will have to ask ourselves, what was it like in a world where women had, let's say, social and political authority, and men were not sort of oppressed or submissive, or there wasn't any of that in the community. So that's exciting. And I think this goddess work that we're all doing and that some people have been doing, for decades and decades, may be coming to sort of a crescendo with the archaeological, scientific, and other discoveries that are confirming all of these things that many women have said for many decades. So I would say it's of utmost importance. Goddess work, history work on the goddess, women's history. I would say that we are at the peak of change.
Yeah, yeah. And for me, it really is, as you said, we're told, right, that men have always been in power or the patriarchy has always been here. I don't really like to use the word patriarchy because it's so misunderstood.
It
and
is.
just and often used, right, as kind of a weapon or gross labeling of something rather than a real understanding that men are not necessarily the patriarchy, and the patriarchy is more of a system that's been put in place and all of that,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And I also think that as we uncover these ancient goddess temples, as we go and receive their wisdom, as we research and understand what ancient civilizations lived like when women were in power, when the goddess was revered,
Yeah.
for me, the biggest takeaway has been it wasn't always this way, right?
Right.
Like, it's not what we've been told. We have been very intentionally kept from this ancient wisdom because it serves us to
Yes.
remember our power and our truth and our sovereignty. And
Yes.
as I started to research the goddess and religious history and ancient civilizations and mythology, I came into my own remembrance of, okay, so if it hasn't always been this way, and the goddess was the most revered deity in some of these ancient civilizations, and which we were in communion with the earth and the elements, and which the body was considered sacred, and which sex was not a sin, right? All these huge concepts
Right.
where there wasn't a submissive, it was a equal partnership between men and women in different ways and different cultures. I'm not saying everyone, right? But that, oh, okay, so that means everything we've been kind of blindly abiding by for the past few thousand years are just beliefs. They're just beliefs, right? And they're beliefs that we have been beholden to because we haven't known otherwise. And we think this is the way it is. And that's what we've been told. Because
Yes.
if we think it's always been this way, we think there is no other way. And
Yeah.
that's how today in modern society we can go, oh, well, if it hasn't been this way and they're just beliefs, there is another way. And maybe that way is the way I just haven't discovered yet, right?
Yes.
And maybe that way is accessible to me. And maybe we get this ancient wisdom from these cultures that lived in more harmony with the
Yeah.
natural world and each other. And we use that today to create a better world rather than being enslaved to this idea of power over dynamics.
Right. Right. Exactly. Exactly. I think that's the key to ancient wisdom. And, interestingly, I'm not sure that the ancients had any intention of us sort of, what I mean is that I don't think that they intended to provide us with instructions in the way that we need today. Um, so for example, what I'm saying is, for example, sometimes some of my students will say to me, well, how come women didn't write anything while they were inside these temples or priestesses or whatever? And I asked myself that question as well, because there have been lots of temples uncovered. And as far as we know, so without falling into conspiracy theories, because those are obviously unprovable, there aren't any documents within the temples or within certain sites of women writing the rituals or the performances or things like that. And in my conversation with some of my students at the center, at the Artemis Center, we've sort of had this maybe a kind of revelation or a kind of inspiration of what if women, and we're talking about women now, but it could have been everyone. What if people who perform these rituals took it for granted that this is something that everyone would know forever because they had a system of passing down information. They had a system of initiations. They had a system of performance that was very commonly known. Okay, for women's rituals, for example, that were closed within the temple doors, still all of the women within that community knew the rituals, knew the songs, knew this, knew the symbolism, knew all of that. So I remember one of my students saying, what if they just thought that by leaving us these symbols or by just passing down these small things, of course we would understand what that means. In the sense that perhaps no one saw this chasmic break between the ancient world and then the monotheistic world that came next, and then the dark ages, and then the technological world, and where we are now. And so ancient wisdom really is us looking back, trying to decode from what we found what their practices were that they took for granted, and then understanding how commonplace that was for them. where for us, we have to wrap our minds around it. Does that make sense? Like
Yeah.
when I think about how many goddess temples there were, how many celebrations and festivals that women and men, but women went to on their own, where they celebrated their bodies, where they celebrated the rhythms and nature. Like they had the psychology of that they took for granted, for us is something we have to try to wrap our minds around, right? What's it like to be a little girl and just go to initiation rituals all the time because that's what you do? And then you go to these festivals where women are in charge of, I don't know, the fertility of agriculture, like the Eleusinian mysteries, or the afterlife or whatever. Even if we call this, let's say if we're talking about the Greeks here, as a patriarchal state, okay, I say that again in quotations, the women had much more celebrations in space under that so-called patriarchal state than we do today, So the psychology of that, I try to put myself in that frame of mind. What's it like to grow up like that? What's it like to hang out with women like that from a young age across the experiences of life? So I think the ancient wisdom is really it's really us getting back to what is the norm, is us getting back to this idea that it is very normal to have these activities in our lives, to worship the feminine divine, to practice that worship together, right? I mean, that was very, quote unquote, normal for the ancients. And for us, it's a real, in order to go to a women's event or things like that, first of all, we have to overcome a lot of prejudice and bias and et cetera to start making circles and having circles. And then still, it takes a lot to create a gathering. It takes a lot, right? So what used to be taken for granted as standard now is exceptional, or maybe not exceptional anymore, I hope, but, special, right? So we're getting there, but it's a lot of like, yeah, it's almost like we have an old box of wisdom that we haven't looked into, and here we are now opening and going, oh my goodness, look at all these great things that are in here that we can then apply to our daily lives. Yeah.
And they were so much more connected to life itself. And part of that is because they weren't living behind computer screens all the time and working 9-to-5 jobs. And
Yes.
right, they were
Yes.
living in community because
Yes.
they had to live in community. And I mean, a lot of ancient civilizations, my understanding is particularly in Sumer and ancient Egypt, were very advanced, and they had very advanced education system, math systems, time systems, water, aqueducts. Even in ancient Rome and Pompeii, like the water systems are still like astounding for us today, right? We don't even know how to build the temples they build or the pyramids they build. And so they were way more advanced than we're led to believe. I think we have kind of fallen in consciousness.
Yes.
And for me, that fall in consciousness came when we stopped revering the earth. We stopped revering the goddess. And that fall of consciousness, I trace back to that exact same time in history. And the fall of consciousness is really this idea that there's only a male god, right? And they took away the feminine counterpart, which denied the divinity of the feminine, which included women. But what it was also denying was life as sacred, the body as sacred, the self as sacred. It was only out and above that we could find that, quote, connection with the divine. Now, my understanding is that took a few thousand years to really stamp out. There were a lot of violence and warfare. But there was always this resistance, right? And that resistance still lives in many of us. I know it lives in us, the two of us, and many other people who say, yeah, and I know something different, and I'm here to help people see something different and tap into that power that is there, even though we've been told, right, we can't, or we shouldn't, or we're not allowed, right?
Exactly.
Adam and Eve and many other myths tell us that.
Yes.
And at the same time, just that simple reverence for life can make a drastic difference in how we show up. Like that reverence for life. Like, yes, both of us probably guide people into very deep and profound practices and beliefs and systems and reflection. And also just listening to a bird and watching the water and right, these taking in the breath and knowing you can't be separate from the air around you. You can't
Yeah.
be separate from the waters. You breathe them in, you take them in. You can't be separate from the earth. And just that, right? If we showed up living that way, our lives would change. I know that for certain. Before I was a soul embodiment guide and then doing what I do now, I was a prosecutor, I was an attorney. I had a very different life in which I was living from the head up. And it's this ancient wisdom of the feminine, which is of life, of the body, of the sacred.
Yes.
It drastically changed my experience of how I live life, right? I mean, how could it not?
Yes. Yes. And that's a challenge because, in the ancient world, everyone was living in connection to nature. There was no other option. And for us today, it's almost like we wait for people to arrive or we wait for people to show up, right? It's the same for me. I spent so much time in my mind. I continue to do that because that's the programming, right? As a researcher, as an academic, that's the programming. And I have to say that I enjoy that to some degree. But remembering to not always be cerebral and blah, blah, blah. But that is still a blessing and a privilege for me, right? Because many others don't have I don't know what it is. It's not always want or need, but it's that sort of, or call. They have other things that they're bombarded with in their lives. And so what I'm saying is that the job now is a little bit harder for significantly harder for connection, actually, versus coming from a totally, let's say, agricultural or even hunter-gatherer society where you are constantly though in nature. So even if you are straying here or you're moving towards, I don't know, living in a city back then, you still were always in. So it is easier to tap into the magic of that time, to tap into that magic at that time, into nature. It was easier to have a conversation about, like you said, water, air, earth, trees, because that was a given. People around you would have been like, yes, of course. So I think our challenge is even just exposing the population to the reality of that knowledge. People know that. They know that when you go for a walk in nature, and I was talking to my mother today, say maybe go for a walk. They know that going for a walk outside is good for them. But number one, not everyone feels like it because everyone's overwhelmed with all kinds of stuff. Number two, not everyone has time, blah, blah, blah. So it's like, how can we recreate a world as clearly connected as the ancient world in a world today where we are so deeply disconnected? And some people are coming back to that wisdom, but it's taking some time, right? So we won't be able to have or replicate what was before. We're going to have to come up with something that works for the realities of this time.
In the now.
And that has never been done before. So, right? So here we are, a little bit like walking in the dark because we're trial and error, lots of trial and error. Yes, we have a lot of that ancient knowledge and we're gaining more of it, but then figuring out what works when you apply it, that becomes also a bit of a trial and error. So, I mean, it's kind of exciting times. Like people say, we're living in historical times, but there are some challenges that the ancients didn't have, right? So they weren't fighting against something, or they weren't fighting to push up against, in the same way that we are. They were living their lives, connected. And I mean, they had their own problems. They had lots of wars. They had some disease, they had, I don't know, famines. They had their own problems. We're not saying it was a utopia or it was a time of, non-suffering. Of course, people died, people were lost to all kinds of accidents, things like that. So they had their own issues, but because they were naturally or daily connected to a lot of these wisdoms and energies, yeah, they lived a significantly different psychology than we can at this point. I don't know. I mean, because we're not all going to go back to nature. Uh, people are not going to give up their cars and luxury items, and so trying to figure out how to reconnect in this day and age is probably our modern challenge, I guess.
And it doesn't have to be separate though, right?
Right.
Or at least in my experience, it doesn't have to be separate. I have lost everything I owned several times in my life, be it through a flood or other things. And it's not that those things are bad. It's not that there's anything wrong with having a house and having a shelter. I feel grateful I have shelter and a comfortable bed and don't have to sleep on hard ground or pebbles or rocks, or right. I'm warm when it's raining and cold outside and sheltered from the wind. And right, I'm so grateful that I don't have to go hunt for my food every time I want to eat. And
True.
and
Yes.
and it is our relationship with those things that determines our reality, particularly our inner reality, our inner state. It is that gratitude for the fact that we get to eat. We get to eat
Right.
from the earth, and that it is still the earth that provides all of that. It doesn't come from a grocery store. Food doesn't come from a grocery store. There are people who think food comes from a grocery store. When at some point in my life, I remember thinking when I first volunteered on an organic farm in France, when I went on a spiritual pilgrimage back in 2013, I was already in my 30s. I remember still having this moment going, I've never pulled food out of the ground. Like, is it safe to eat like that? Right. And that's so kind of laughable and scary and sad. And the reality of many of us who have only ever eaten from a grocery store. And so there's this, we can still enjoy that benefit of that, say, for example, right? And have the consciousness and the awareness that it is the earth and the rain and the sun and the air that give us the capacity to eat food, to live life, and connect with the organic elements of life with appreciation and connection, rather than the complete separation that we have been, I would say, brainwashed to not know any different, to not have the connection with the consciousness that exists within all things.
Yeah.
And to me, that's the separation that is wounding us, because how many people do you know that are fully activated, life force energy, joyful, grateful, appreciative, like in connection with all things and the divine within themselves and all of life, and live that way and vibrate that and radiate that is, to me, like the essence of why we're actually here. But when we're operating according to this, I sometimes call it like a slave paradigm, right? You work hard, you work hard, you work hard. Where's life? Where's life? Where's life? Like, oh, but you have to. The survival grid that has been on our planet for a very long time, which is what we're coming up face to face with right now. We are literally being asked, and this might sound a little far-fetched, but for me, in my experience working with Gaia, working with the goddess, is that we are being asked to move our root system, our nervous system, from this survival grid. I have to do this for money. I have to do this to survive. I have to do this to be safe, whether it be a job, whether it be I need love, I need value, right? To regridding and reconnecting the root to our divine consciousness, which to me is sovereignty, right? Soul embodiment is sovereignty. When we embody our divinity, to regrid our root, our energetic system to this, I am divine, and we operate as that, everything shifts. Now that's quite a shift, right?
Yes.
But it's possible. And I do believe that's why things seem so, let's just say, crazy and intense right now, and activating in not so pleasant ways. And there's a lot of fear because that fear has been the very thing that has controlled us and led to the suppression of the goddess. That same exact fear led to the suppression of the goddess. So if we have the opportunity to then transmute that now for the past and go, I let that fear, each one of us at some point agreed on a conscious or unconscious level, I let that fear keep me separate from my divinity, from the divine within all life, from the goddess. That's what she represents, the divine in life, right? I let that fear keep me separate. And I get to choose differently now, despite all of this fear, despite all of this, you have to, and the survival and the blah, 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 blah. You can't choose. You don't have rights. Yes, you do. Yes, we do. And shift out of the fear into that sovereignty, into that empowerment, into that force of the goddess that can shift and create new realities. Like I have experienced her working her magic into physicality because the spiritual comes first. Energy forms matter, not the other way around. And so we can use this wisdom to shift our physical reality. And it doesn't have to take another couple thousand years, but it does take our consciousness and our choice.
Yeah. That has a lot of depth, what you're saying. I mean, obviously, but I'm just thinking, sorry, now I'm just thinking about the way you're saying it. In many ways, we have come significantly farther than the ancients in the sense that I am not sure, and again, here we are generalizing for all the ancients, okay, but we're just having a conversation, but I am not sure that ancient peoples thought about programming, grids like we talk about, even sovereignty of body and soul, the way that we're thinking about now. So what I'm saying is, I think we have evolved despite the oppression and suppression. We have evolved. And perhaps the ancient wisdom is the tool that we kind of reach back for to help push through this. So I don't know if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not that we are trying to relive like they did in many ways, because like we said, we can't, but also maybe we don't need to.
We create something new.
Right, because we've lived through that, right? So we've lived through that. We're here now. Our understanding. So, for example, the technology, the information, all of these things are still tools that we can use in order to free ourselves. And the ancient wisdom, I think, is part of that memory of what was the norm for us, what we experienced, and how do we tap into that and process it and use it today. So I think what you're saying is quite fascinating in the sense that we are a whole new, well, I don't know if it's new, but a whole different energy today that is made up of both the freedom and connections and mysteries of the ancient world, and then the trauma of the last 2,000 years or 5,000 years. And then here we are awaking, like people say, which is sort of like we've been dormant for a while. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. But now you awaken in a different reality, and therefore you must, figure out your way through. So it's quite fascinating. Because I think you're right. I think that we can't go back, obviously. We can't live like they used to. We know too much, right? It's like you can't unknow what you know. We know too much, we've seen too much, we experienced too much, and yet we don't know enough about some of these ancient, right? So we are in this new place of evolution, right? With both good and bad. And trying to figure that out, I think, is where the ancient wisdom plays a key role as a tool to what could have, like the expansion of consciousness, the expansion of worship, right? Because they were so much more expanded back then in those fields of wisdom, which were then closed to us for 2,000 years. So now we're kind of, again, opening up, even though it looks like chaos, but we're opening up again to a kind of expansion, right? So it's quite fascinating because I guess in many ways it's unknowable. We don't know what what the future will look like. We're living in a time that obviously has never been before, but also, in history, there's patterns of behavior, there's patterns of empires, there's patterns of power, blah, blah, blah. And now we're living in a time where there's a potential that we break some of those patterns. And that is new in many ways,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I love the way you're kind of putting that into that deeper perspective of highlighting we can't go back, and we are creating something new in a very new way, and something I've been playing with. And I would love to know, maybe you found research I haven't, or maybe you have a different perspective about this, because something I've been playing with is that now the ancients, they had access to a lot of spiritual technologies that we don't, right? Sound, and they directed their temples to many of the stars, and they used the solstice and these other powerful times on the planet to, we don't know what exactly, but we know that that's what the temples were orchestrated for or attuned to. And we know that they built things we still don't know how to build. And like the megalithic stone structures in Malta, for example, I know that you went there as well. And like they have these 15,000 ton stones just stacked on top, stacked on top, stacked on top. It's just incredible. From 5, 7,000, 9,000 years ago. How in the world, right? And that somehow survived for 5, 7, 9,000 years. And which most of our things just fall away in like one big storm, right? So it's fascinating. And at the same time, it also seems like they were still in many ways seeing the divine outside themselves. They were still in many ways like, oh, these star beings, which maybe are what they called the gods and goddesses, other star beings, who knows, right? That makes a lot of sense to me. And using that and accessing these technologies. And now, and then we went to that one monotheistic God. This is the one God. And he's a man and looks like us. We basically made God in man's image, right? Not the other way around. And then
Right.
and so we had to obey and we had to submit, or else we die and we're punished and we're eternally like in hell. And this crazy, it's so seemingly archaic concepts, right? But somehow very effective for thousands of years. Okay, so we can still access this ancient spiritual technology and the stars and work with the land and life and the elements, and recognize maybe there is one source, just not one man in the sky, and bring that and recognize that in ourselves to embody our divinity. And for me, I know that that's the impulse within me, right? And the work I do, or just in myself, right? Like we walk the path of ourselves, and to embody my divinity, to operate as the divine I am, to not let it be just a concept, not let it just be an idea, to not let it be something I just think about, but bring into how I live, how I talk, how I show up, how I relate to my body, my sexuality, my everything, the food, everything, and then align everything to that, which is new on this planet, my understanding. What do you think about? Have you seen where other civilizations really felt like they were embodying the divine?
That's a good question. I love this idea of spiritual technology. So I agree with you. And I think this is very well evidenced that they used the vibrations, the energies, in as a technology, which is quite fascinating. I remember hearing about a cave in Turkey, Tukaybeli, where depending on where you stood in the cave and and what kind of drum you were drumming, the vibrations of that sound could elicit anything from joy to crying to devastation to awe. So, and I remember reading the report from the archaeologists and thinking, I can't even wrap my mind around that. Like, how did they figure that out? And then how did they test it? And my brain is asking all these questions. So they very much had those tools to experience let's say, the natural energy and vibrations of the earth. I agree with you also that they did tend to look up or down for the divine. I can only speak for the Greek and Romans, maybe a little bit of the Egyptians, so we're kind of at Anatolia. We're kind of caught in this little geographical space. I can't speak for Asia or the continent of Africa per se. But for those that I can speak for, yes, this idea that I was thinking, the idea that I am divine, it was probably not as popular as the idea of worshiping a divine, creating a relationship with the divine. Though I will say that their relationships with the divine were much more egalitarian than the later monotheistic relationships. And by that, I mean, there seemed to be a negotiation with the divine. You could offer something and expect something in return. You could decide to partner up with this God, or this God might like you better than another God. So it was not an equal relationship. So I'll use the word egalitarian relationship. I don't think they saw themselves as equals, but they certainly saw that they had room to collaborate. And then we get into monotheism, and suddenly you're an oppressed slave to the system and all this kind of stuff. So today, it's true that we have to shed a lot of that shame and guilt, especially if you grew up like I grew up Catholic. So the first time that I realized that Artemis is my collaborator, is my bestie, is my mentor, it took me a really long time to say it out loud or to admit it to myself, because it felt disrespectful, dishonorable in some way, like this divine being. What if she gets mad and like curses you because how dare you think that you are on this? Even though I grew up thinking the spark of the divine is in me, it was always submissive, right? It was always less than the creator, the God, the male representative. So I think that coming to sovereignty in that way, where I see myself, it's even hard to say, where I see myself as equal to a God entity, because I am also God entity. Oh, that's so hard, right? The programming for that, the heaviness to imagine that, like to try and break free from that and imagine that, takes a kind of discipline and repetition and training, right? To forget that. So, and I think that is new in many ways. I can't say that in that way that we're talking about it right now was part of ancient thought. I don't know, because again, we only have a limited amount of writings. And the writings that we have are a bunch of dudes that were quite wealthy and quite privileged and, blah, blah. So if we looked at them today, like if they were part of our population today, we would call them sort of these elite, bro guys, right? Kind of thing. So we only have their writings, and they were pleasing the politicians, they were pleasing the emperor, etc. So I don't want to totally say that the ancients didn't experience that, because if they did, they didn't write it, or we don't have those writings. So we're going to leave them some room that maybe some of them were able to have that realization and work with that energy. But I think for today, for us, I think that's the reality of, that's why I think we're more evolved, because we are now stepping into our divinity as divine beings as much as we can, breaking old patterns. And I think you're right. I think that is the purpose of this life. Well, I think that's almost like if this life was a course on Earth, then sort of the final exam or the passing grade would be that that's the realization, that you embody that divinity. And so then you ascend, kind of thing. It's like that last step before you're like, okay, great, I finished Earth, got my degree in Earth. That was tough, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it definitely is, or seemingly a path of ascension, for sure. That realization of the God state in form, but not as a concept, right? Because there's a lot of spirituality where it's been a concept for a long time. Be God realized, like recognize the divine within you, but to actually then bring that into the body is the feminine. And for me, it was the ancient Egyptian goddess Auset, Isis, known as Isis, Auset, who when she first came to me in embodied vision, I really didn't know much about who she was. And she's kind of my bestie in that sense, like Artemis is yours, right? And she's been guiding me ever since like 2012, basically. And I mean, probably way before that, but consciously. and I really wanted to, in the same way that we're, conditioned even unconsciously to put God above us. I really wanted to put her above me. I really wanted to see her as more than me, as better than me, as more worthy than me, and it just kept being this, no, do not put me above you, right? I am one with you. You are just as powerful. You are just as divine. And it took me a long time. And it's why I do what I do, because like everything that I went through, right, to release the beliefs and the shame and the guilt and all of those feelings of unworthiness, to really begin to source from within, to be sovereign. And her emblem and her hieroglyph was the throne, and she was known as the goddess of sovereignty, right? Because to be sovereign was to sit on one's throne, the throne, I say, of your own divinity, right? That is how we claim our sovereignty. And it's fascinating to me because she was, in some ways, maybe the one who ushered in the quote golden age that we sometimes hear about, or I've heard about, like that there was this golden age in Egypt in which they had bridged more of heaven and earth. I don't think we've seen real evidence, quote, of that, typical archaeological evidence, right? But some people have channeled that through or had memories of that. But I do think that she, as one representative of the goddess, that the earth herself is ushering that in, is asking us to bring up this ancient wisdom, not to repeat the past, not to go back, but to say, okay, that part of us that we had to deny for seven, however many thousands of years, you said, 2,500, 5,000, right? It's within that range that this really took place. That, okay, so what if we bring that up, but in a new way, with the consciousness of the divine and the consciousness of the earth, and meld them into something new? Remember those sacred technologies that we have access to, but also like live life and not ignore this, right? Like it doesn't have to be one or the other, but so no more polarity, this or that, like, matriarchy or patriarchy, but rather this, so if we are all divine, then we're all divine. Like no one is left out of that equation, right? Yes. No one, and then how that shifts our life and our experience and how we show up. I mean, it's a pretty drastic change.
Yeah. I think perhaps that's part of the key of change. Because I think that kind of learning is sort of the threshold for moving forward. The issue, of course, is how everyone reacts and handles that. Like, so how do we approach this type of evolution, let's say spiritual evolution or physical evolution too, without too much ego? I mean, people sometimes say, okay, let's put aside ego. I'm ego or not, whatever, Freud comes up with whatever. But what I mean is like, I don't know that I'm against ego as far as identity and personality in the way that, some traditions are. But I am thinking that there is lots of room for, if people start to call themselves divine without the true deep belief in and the practice, that we could see the dangers in some of that.
And I did want to address what you said about the ego, because most of the work of coming into the divinity is, of course, right, looking at the ego, which, for me, I define the ego in a very simple way, of the ego being the part of us that solely identifies with being purely physical and nothing more. Like, I am only physical, I'm separate from the divine. And so that part of ourselves does not need to be cast out. That part of ourselves does not need to be ignored, because that part of ourselves is going to rule the subconscious and how we show up in the world. If we don't then infuse that with love, with the consciousness of the divine, and then align the ego, which is basically our subconscious, which is basically our mind and our thoughts and our beliefs we've inherited, align that with our divinity. And how do we avoid it being, just like basically like a bunch of ego rulers thinking like I'm the only one and I'm divine, right? Like, because clearly there's some evidence of that right now happening in the world.
Exactly.
I'm like, I'm
Right?
the only one and I can
Right?
decide for everybody else and nobody else has a choice because I have this. And that's been around for 5,000
Yes.
years of
Right.
like, there are some that are good, there are some that are bad, there's
Yes.
some that are worthy, there's some that are unworthy. Now, the original ancient cultures, we don't have evidence I've seen of that, but that came in, right? And why? That's a whole other question. Like, why did that happen on this planet, right? That was the fallen consciousness, in my opinion.
Right.
And the only way for me that I can see that we resolve that is through love. Because if you are aligned to the consciousness of love, which is different than a mental consciousness of spirituality, love can't think that, like, that's you're in the vibration, the frequency of love, which is the goddess. I mean, the goddess has always been associated with love in many of the ancient cultures. Our understanding of love is also very misunderstood. And that's, again, there's so many different pieces and facets of this, right? But then I always am then left the question, right, of like, yeah, but there are still people who maybe that's just not their path in this lifetime. Maybe that's not what they're choosing, and they don't want that, and they don't want to elevate their consciousness. And that has been, I think, one of the greatest difficulties for me. And even recently, I was reading the poems of Eda Hawana, which was the first author known author who was a temple priestess of Inanna, an ancient Sumer. And they have discovered her writings, the original author, the most ancient writings of a woman, of a temple priestess. And she basically, says those things of like, am I being punished? Like, Inanna, like, where are you? Because they were punishing her because she was a temple priestess and they were taking her out of the temple. And this is documented. That's what they did to those who worshiped the goddess and those who were powerful, strong women, is they forced us. I've had past life memories of this, but they forced us and they killed us and they turned us into slaves and prostitutes. And I've had many years of healing that wound. And I still have this, but what do we do about that? What do we do about those in the world that still want to do that? There's still a lot of rape. There's still a lot of sexual assault. All you have to do is turn on the news to see lust and objectification of the body. And and it does grieve me. And I don't know that there's any way around that grief.
Right.
And I will not let their blindness become mine.
Right.
And it is ultimately, this is where I've come with it. I'm not saying this is my final forever.
Right.
That I will not let their blindness, their lack of consciousness, their lack of love, their lack of recognition of my divinity, I will not let that take me away from it anymore. Right. Because this consciousness is what I take with me forever. And I will maintain that recognition, ideally, no matter what. Because really, isn't that the illusion? Isn't that kind of the polarity, the illusion, the fall of consciousness, the belief that I could be separate from that? So the belief that this other person could do something that could make me separate from that is actually the illusion itself. So the more I can maintain the awareness of the union, I am already that, and nothing takes that away, then for me, that's the kind of golden ticket, at least of my consciousness. It doesn't take away my humanity, and that can create pain, but it does take away the suffering. And that's what the goddess Aoset taught, is that suffering is the denial of our divinity.
Right.
But we can still feel pain, because pain, in a way, is a facet of life that when we feel pain, we're actually fully alive.
Right. Right. No, that makes sense. Yeah, that's really beautiful. that's
Well, I
sad.
just
So it was all fun.
realized it's already been 1 hour. Can you believe we've already
Yes.
talked for an hour? So I feel like we should start to wrap up
All
and
right.
I want to talk about a retreat that I'm offering where people can access this wisdom. But first, I want you to talk about a little bit more of what you do, if you want to direct people to your website, how they can find you, anything you feel like sharing.
Yes, thank you. So, if they want to find me anywhere online, I'm under Artemis Expert. That's pretty much across all social media. And then the Artemis Research Center.com, artemiscenter.com, both work, is the website. And on there, there's like the courses that I have and that I teach, and then the books that I wrote on Artemis and the map for the temples. So everything will be there. But so those are the two ways, because then on those places, there's all kinds of other links that they can just click around and get to know sort of what I do and
And
what I'm
courses on Artemis and this history and the
And the
goddess
goddess, yeah, we
wisdom.
just finished a course that was really wonderful called Frozen Realms. So I have a teaching partner that I teach with, and we were looking at winter goddesses, but and sometimes different times of the year we teach different things, but sometimes I feel a bit inspired to talk about something, um, and uh, and we put something together based on that inspiration, and then teach. Mostly, actually, I think it's something that exactly like what we've been talking about. A part of it is a learning of the ancient data, and the other part is the applicability of that knowledge. So I like to set up the courses in that way, where we meet live on Zoom or whatever, but then we have a part of it is a lecture, but then the other part is really applying some of that knowledge, because I think people are fascinated by mythology and ancient history and artifacts, and that's great to talk about, and I love to talk about that stuff. But then it's like, okay, so what do we do with all of this? And so that's the applicability part of it. Then we run through exercises of, how do you apply some of that knowledge? And so I really love to, I mean, I teach at the university here in Toronto, although those courses are more philosophy and sort of standard, rigid academia. But the other stuff that I teach under the Artemis Center is really just it's just for the love of learning kind of thing,
Mhm.
and teaching the material. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's beautiful. And I'll put all the links below. So if you're listening to this, you can just go and scroll and look for the links and check out the Artemis Center and all the courses and offerings that Carla has. And yeah, I'll just mention about a retreat that I'm leading to Greece where people can actually have the opportunity to access this wisdom in a really embodied way. Because for me, it's like, yeah, we can go to the sites and we can we can just like have this intellectual understanding of it of like, oh, or maybe there's some energy, right? But what I really want to guide people to is to really understand like what is the wisdom here, both on an intellectual level and guided tours, but also on this real embodied level. And for me, I have the pleasure and privilege and gift of being able to channel that energy up and help others channel the energy up into our bones, into our bodies, so that it really works with our own energy system and we can access the gifts of each site more consciously that the goddess has for us, so that we bring the ancient wisdom of the temples into ourselves and then take them with us. So like what I like to say is this is a sacred feminine power retreat. We're going to Greece. I think it's September 27th or October 8th of this year, 2025. But what I like to say about it is that you become a living temple of the goddess, because then
Oh, I
you
love
are
that.
vibrating that that energy of the goddess out into wherever you go, right? And when I was in Delphi last fall, I spent a couple of weeks there just like tuning into the land and the energies and connecting. And it was so clear. She said, bring the women now,
Wow.
bring the women. And at first I'm like, next year? So like, wait, bring the women, 2025, bring the women. So basically the same time I was there last year, we'll be in
Wow.
Delphi. But we're going to Athens, Nafplio. I know you're going on to do
Yes.
this mapping of the Artemis temples, and you'll be in Nafplion or Nafplio, depending on which the English or the Greece version
Yes.
in May. And that's a region where there's these ancient Mycenaean civilizations from 1700 BC. I mean, well over, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, and some of these ancient stone temples. And it's just so rich and full of history. And then the Acropolis in Athens is just stunning. And oh my God, so magical, lit up at night, just being in that energy right? It's
Yes.
just amazing.
Yes.
So
It's
yeah, I'm really
amazing.
excited to take other women there to really
Yes.
experience
That
it.
sounds wonderful. Just that sounds amazing. And taking the time to
Mhm,
channel those energies. Yeah, that sounds wonderful.
mhm.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's time because they, talking about why this ancient wisdom matters and how we bring it into the current day collective. It's when we, even though we don't necessarily understand intellectually all of this, when we bring that ancient wisdom up into the body and we put it in the collective field, because our consciousness can't be disconnected from the consciousness around us. It's impossible, right? It's easy to be like, oh, that over there and that person and this thing happening. The reality is our consciousness cannot be separate like from the consciousness of the world. It is all
Right.
interconnected. But as we choose individually to elevate our consciousness, we then elevate the consciousness of the collective. And so when we go and we consciously lift this consciousness of these ancient temples, even as you're doing in May on your studies and mapping, we're lifting the consciousness into our feet. We're bringing it into the awareness, into the grid.
Right.
And we're saying, yes, we get to remember this. This gets to be part of our consciousness on this planet right now, and
Yeah.
utilize it and embody it. And it can shift our world in ways that I don't even think that we could understand,
Right.
bringing that feminine wisdom and that feminine power back. It's really amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Sounds
I'm so
wonderful.
grateful for the work that you're doing.